The scope of Tears of the Kingdom is absolutely insane as far as we can tell. Today we'll be using inferences based on the information that we have on Tears of the Kingdom to see just how fruitful the game really is. Knowing what I will go over in today's video, I can say with confidence that Nintendo is hiding probably their biggest and most ambitious game ever. This is a game that will need to last somewhere between 5, 6, or even 7 years before a new title is in our hands. So, will the game's scope allow for this to happen? Even with the base world being one that we already explored to the fullest extent in Breath of the Wild? Well, you'll get to decide after today's video. I will admit that the script for this video was completed a day before the final Tears of the Kingdom trailer was released, and because of that I had to make some slight alterations to the script, so I'm sorry for the timing of this video as it was delayed for that reason. The first thing that we'll go over are the different map areas. It's guaranteed that we'll have 3 different major map components or areas. One being the overworld of Hyrule, all filled with new challenges and quests. We have the Sky Islands, which seem to be extremely vast in number, and will stretch all the way throughout Hyrule. There also appears to be different themed islands, such as the Snow-filled Islands, with extra places for Link to enter. Based on the trailers and the art book, some of these islands will hold sky puzzles for the players to complete. It's also not unrealistic to believe that there will be new enemies to fight specific to these Sky Islands, as well as a new dragon, which we've seen in the screenshot. I would say that the new enemies include things like Zonai constructs, however, we've seen them on the base part of Hyrule as well as the Sky Islands, so they're not going to exclusively be on the Sky Islands. What is almost exclusively on the Sky Islands are the larger Zonai constructs, which do attack Link. Who's to say that there aren't more kinds of these enemies? The fact that there are already over 7 kinds of Zonai enemies, both friendly and hostile of various sizes, leads me to believe that there's just going to be a bunch more. Delving back to the Sky Islands, due to the vast amount and size of these islands, and it being the central focus for the past couple of Tears of the Kingdom trailers, we should definitely assume that a bulk of the story will take place in this setting, maybe as much as the overworld. We've even seen things like Sidon assisting Link with fighting a construct up in one of the Sky Islands, which is just crazy. The third confirmed setting, or as I previously described, map area, that will be included in Tears of the Kingdom is the Underground. The Underground was a setting that was just briefly touched upon with different locations in Breath of the Wild, but here in Tears of the Kingdom, it seems to be an extremely expansive space. The Underground has been a focus, so much so that it was the setting for the majority of the 2019 Tears of the Kingdom revealed teaser. Due to us seeing Zelda, Ganondorf, inscriptions on the walls, new cave-like entrances in the overworld, and much more, it's also safe to assume that the Underground will play a more than minor part in Tears of the Kingdom. Furthermore, we see malice-stained enemies and pools of malice found nowhere else but within these caves from a recent Tears of the Kingdom trailer. I mean, these malice-stained enemies have to have something different about them or to them that their normal enemy counterparts can't realize. Some sort of mechanic, function, something. We also see Link running from a returning but redesigned Hinox in what seems to be in a cave-like structure. Not to mention, there were several art in the Tears of the Kingdom art book which depicted advanced structures in what was obviously a cave. I'm pretty confident that a dungeon, if not multiple, will take place underground in Tears of the Kingdom. Now that we have 3 confirmed settings out the way, let's move on to something that isn't confirmed. Although this isn't confirmed, this feature is pretty intuitive and there's a bunch of evidence for it, and that's underwater gameplay. Now during the gameplay showcase, you might have seen my reaction to getting absolutely baited with the underwater gameplay towards the end of the video.
And we're back on the surface.
This was when Link was diving from a Sky Island and onto the surface of Hyrule's overworld. To avoid taking an insane amount of fall damage, Aonuma flies into a river. Once Link lands, he simply returns to the surface of the river. However, this does not mean that there's a lack of underwater gameplay. We see in the Tears of the Kingdom art books that there are lots of major structures that reside in water. We also see a particularly interesting thing within the art book. There's a structure which is kind of obviously placed underneath the surface of water. If it's not, then I can't wait to explain what it actually is when I do play the game. Proceeding with the understanding that this structure is submerged underwater, then we can see the same ripples on the see-through ceiling of the structure that appears when performing the Ascend ability. This indicates that you will be able to ascend through the structure's ceiling and into the water, indicating some sort of underwater exploration. Even in the presentation, some have noticed that the ascend meter lights up when Link is submerged underwater and returns to normal when Link reaches the surface. This is more evidence of underwater gameplay, as the game recognizes when Link is underwater. Now, the biggest confirmed piece of evidence against the fact that there would be underwater gameplay is that there are new aerial water balls that Link dives into and uses to traverse up the Sky Islands. Maybe some of these will be of varying sizes, meaning the ascend ability will be used for convenience in this particular instance, thus why the ascend meter lights up when underwater and why it recognizes when Link is underwater. Let's diverge from the setting and talk about another huge talking point, the crafting system. It seems as though Tears of the Kingdom is sticking to a theme with these Breath of the Wild line of games. That theme is resourcefulness. In Breath of the Wild, you had to manage your inventory in a particular manner, primarily to account for the fact that your weapons will eventually break. Now, a lot of people didn't like the durability system in Breath of the Wild and claimed that the game was poor because of it. Now, I'll address this system in a video post the launch of Tears of the Kingdom. Just know that I didn't particularly have a problem with it. However, Nintendo was forced to address this complaint as it was one of the most prevalent in Breath of the Wild. In response, they added an ability dubbed Fuse. This allows Link to combine weapons with earthly material, other weapons, and even other items. Now, we still don't understand how it affects the durability system in terms of making some weapons permanent, or how the durability system affects the fused weapons. However, we do have an understanding that the durability of a weapon is either increased or reset after activating the fused ability. We can also assert the idea that this ability will dramatically increase the amount of weapons that are in the game and will bend the potential for resourcefulness and creativity. We understand from the art book that the enemy horns, talons, and toenails will all be of use and is probably the primary focus of weapon fusing. This provides a more intimate experience in terms of dealing with enemies, as their drops are now going to directly affect your gameplay. Not only does this provide a heightened experience when dealing with enemies, as they again play an increased role in your resourcefulness, however, this also creates a more fruitful experience with the world around you. Imagine chopping a tree down on purpose just to fuse it with one of your weapons, likewise with a boulder. These items that can attach aren't limited to combat items. Attaching a slab of meat to an arrow, which appears to be a thing, would allow you to attract certain wildlife or enemies in one particular area. We've seen things like mushrooms, which turn into smoke bombs, and korok fronds, which will probably blow enemies away as the arrow nears its target. We even have a sword and shield fused together simultaneously, combining offense and defense. And let's not forget that we didn't even take into account all the new additional items that will add to the combat system that we haven't seen yet. Imagine all the different ways that the world will be used for our disposal. We didn't even take into account different weapons that output unique things. For instance, the cannons that we see Link use in the trailer. Will there be an ice variant or an electricity variant? And what can you combine with these? Will dragon scales be able to combine with weapons? Probably. How about animal horns? The Ultra Hand ability is an absolute game changer. Aonuma wasn't lying when he said that you can fully use your imagination with this ability. We see Link create an entire robot the size of a stone talus. What else can you create, and how will it affect our gameplay? Imagine every single experience, fighting enemies, completing quests, solving puzzles, but this time with the creation of something you've made with Ultra Hand. I bet you can traverse the lava with an Ultra Hand creation, or you are able to stand in a bog or fly up a tower or something. The next thing that I want to go over are the enemies. It's apparent through the trailers and the artwork that different enemies will be appearing in Tears of the Kingdom, and we'll get into that later. For now, it's important to not forget about the enemies that are returning to Hyrule, and to be honest, I believe most, if not all, enemies will be returning to Tears of the Kingdom from Breath of the Wild, because where else would they be going? We know what will be happening to our main three enemy types, Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos, as they have all updated their horns to bolster the scale of the crafting system. The Bokoblin horns looks as though they are meant to be attached to spears, but may not be limited to swords, arrows, and other items. The same can be said about Moblin horns. They're displayed being able to attach to swords and definitely look too bulky to be arrowheads or even spear tips. This begs the question on how the crafting system will be limited. It's also a good time to bring up the fact that the Moblins attack Link with their horns, possibly alluding to different attack patterns among all the returning enemies in Hyrule. The Lizalfos' horns looks as though they're meant to be attached to swords, but could very well attach to spears and other weapons. However, they do look too bulky to be arrowheads. This leads us to the rest of the returning enemies. The Talus, aside from hosting Bokoblin camps, seem to be unchanged, although I could be wrong. time will just have to tell. Hinoxes seem to have changed based on now having a respectable horn, and of course, in Breath of the Wild, there are 3 tiers of Hinoxes. Instead of a necklace of weapons, we see that it holds some sort of luminous boulder. If this is a weapon or an integral part of a puzzle, we will soon find out. The Molduga seems to be unchanged besides the fact that they now roam in packs and are not limited to the sand. This breeds very interesting questions on what role the Molduga will play in this game. Will we be able to fight all 9 of them as Link, or is it just to show off the scale of this character's power? I hope it's the former. And of course we have the Lynels. Now I made an entire video dedicated to Lynels and Tears of the Kingdom, but that was a couple years back. With more information about Tears of the Kingdom, we can assume that their horns will be massive and will be used to make an insane kinds of weapons. Based on the 3rd trailer, this is exactly the case. With the assertion that all returning enemies will have different movesets, we can safely assume that the Lynel will also have a completely different moveset. This should especially be the case since Lynels held the most sophisticated moveset in the entire Breath of the Wild game, which prompted players to scrutinize and learn it to the fullest extent. It's almost an essential part of becoming a seasoned Breath of the Wild player. Lynels also held some very powerful weapons in Breath of the Wild. However, Aonuma sort of suggests that we'll be getting more powerful weapons by combining certain materials. So I do think Lynels will still have powerful tools at their disposal. However, I also think that they'll reside more within their horns rather than their weapons. Based on the most recent Tears of the Kingdom trailer, Lynels will now be a common enemy, or at least an enemy that is no longer the strongest. The next enemy to think about are the Yiga clan members. In the art book, we see NPCs dressing as Sheikah members. Maybe to spice things up, there's an actual war between the Sheikah and the Yiga. We do see in the most recent trailer that villagers and other NPCs fight Link in abundance, so this might not be far-fetched. Getting back to the Yiga clan members though, they obviously don't have horns or anything, but they typically possess sophisticated ninja weaponry. Perhaps the Yiga will expand their Japanese-inspired weapons with tools such as shurikens or flails. Perhaps the Blade Masters will no longer be the highest rank of Yiga Enforcer with the absence of Master Koga. Perhaps some will have evolved to appear more like Suga. With the heavy prevalence of Zonai items replacing the prevalence of Sheikah items, it's safe to assume that there will be several Zonai enemies replacing, for instance, the Guardian Scouts or the Guardians. We'll probably see those in our dungeons, and there will probably also be Zonai bosses. They're probably going to be flying Zonais, Zonais that target you, Zonais that have different weapons such as flamethrowers, just like all types of stuff. Choo-choos are confirmed to be in the game as we collect their jelly to add to our arrows. I believe that they'll largely remain unchanged, meaning they'll remain boring enemies to fight. However, they will definitely prove useful, especially if elemental aerials will be replaced with the attributes of Chew Jelly. Finally, we have Wizrobes and Octorks. Octorks will be making a return, known for their deadly aim. It's going to be very interesting to be able to use the recall ability to return their boulder to sender. As for the Wizrobes, I'm not sure how they'll change. In the art book, however, we do see a wand-like weapon which resembles what the Wizrobes carry. My suggestion was that we can kill a Wizrobe, gain an elemental essence, and place it in the wand to carry out any sort of elemental attack that we want. We see something similar to this in Age of Calamity, where you kill a Wizrobe and gain their elemental essence so you can use it yourself as a wand attack. I'd be lying if I said I was excited to see the return of style enemies. For the most part, they're just reskins of their normal counterparts with unsophisticated movesets and can effortlessly be beaten. Not only are these enemies annoying, but they're used to artificially interrupt your night in Hyrule. With these, I would love to see some actual sophistication, because I fully expect the style enemies to only have a new animation in terms of coming out of the ground and having the ability to hold new weapons. The style enemies should do something substantial that their normal counterparts cannot. Maybe they remain alive and their collectibles entail not only their undead appendages, but also their heads. This way, when we shoot a bow and arrow with their head as the tip of an arrow, they'll actually act like a cursed enemy from Breath of the Wild, distracting the enemy that we're shooting the arrow at. I think the easiest way to make the style enemies more interesting is to make different enemy combinations of them. For instance, we see a style Gleeok or a style Boss Bokoblin. Maybe one of these style enemy parts can be integral to an Ultra Hand mechanic, or have the style arm have the ability to pick up certain items or something of that sort. This segues us into the new enemies that we know are coming into the game. The Redeads are a classic Zelda enemy that appears to be making a return based on our first acceptable Tears of the Kingdom trailer. They are known to screech and suck the life out of Link. Pause! Hey yo! By grabbing onto him. I think in an open world environment, these will appear in more enclosed areas and will probably be able to move faster. Here we have our first unidentified enemy. This enemy takes the appearance of a horned troll, the horn creating the head of a hammer. This is probably the first enemy that appears to reside under a different tier system. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, enemies reside in a hierarchy of red, blue, black, and silver. These trolls, however, appear to be within the ranks of fire, ice, electricity, and malice. This leads me to believe that these trolls will be found in areas specific to their attribute. This will cut down on things such as fire and ice breath Lizalfos, who wouldn't be able to add much use to the crafting system, as they just share the same horns as their normal Lizalfos. Or they might have different horns, maybe ignited in flame, frost, and electricity. That would be very interesting. In terms of behavior, I think that they would act more like a moblin than anything, and of course we're referring to the trolls again. But I'm fairly interested in seeing their moveset, how they communicate with other monsters, and if they have elemental attacks. To coincide with my aforementioned prediction, we see a Landmola, or a like enemy, which also has different attributes. Because we know that these things burrow in the very earth, and by virtue of them having different attributes, we can assume that there will be different themed cave areas. It appears that there are lightning, fire, and snow versions alongside the normal versions of this enemy. A highly anticipated enemy that was spotted in the second Tears of the Kingdom trailer was the Gleeok. It is all but confirmed that this will be a sub-boss, one that resides in certain name locations and will respawn during blood moons. Because of the adjective flame being present, my earlier theory of there being ice and or electricity variants has a high likelihood of being correct. We know that they will drop dragon hearts based on this image in the Tears of the Kingdom art book. And finally, we see a new mini-boss that is up in the Sky Islands. This looks like a more aggressive and agile Molduga, which has a crocodilian-like appearance. It seems to be of a dark purple tier, which we also see with some other enemies, like the Lamola and this giant frog, which has been found in the art book. The next element that I want to get into is the main story. Another one of Breath of the Wild's biggest critiques was the execution of its story. With Link waking up after the calamity with his memory no longer intact, the bulk of the story took place during optional, minute-long cutscenes, tons of written text, and within diaries behind false walls. Tears of the Kingdom will have the opportunity to make the presentation of their story one that is more meaningful, as it will take place in the present. This means that our actions as the player will have a direct impact on the story and how it unfolds, making it more relevant. Several occurrences occurred since the events of Breath of the Wild, and because Tears of the Kingdom takes place in the same game world as Breath of the Wild, we're obviously going to need some explanations. Explanations starting with how the Sky Islands appeared in the sky, why Link and Zelda found themselves in the depths of Hyrule Castle exploring to begin with, how Hyrule has progressed after the calamity, and how they will be affected during Ganondorf's uprising. Obviously, what happened to Link's arm, how he got the ancient brace, as we'll refer to it now. What happened to Zelda? What is the objective of the game, specifically? How did these new towers emerge? What are these new Zonai shrines among the ground? How did these new enemies come about, as well as their horns on top of their heads? I also want to bring to light some locations that the story might likely force us to go to. Obviously, the Sky Islands will take some sort of precedence. The same can be said about Hyrule Castle. Obviously, Death Mountain seems to be a place of major importance due to the malice spewing from it. We also see that it's a point of interest in the third trailer, as well as some artwork for a new Goron city, which is pretty exciting. Next is Rito Village. We see in Tabantha this extremely large vortex shrouding the location. This is by no means the only vortex that can be seen, but it's definitely the biggest. How will we be able to enter? What will it be like inside? And what's the objective once we are inside? We also see a bunch of Rito concepts in the art book, meaning they'll play a more than minor role in this story. This is especially the case since we were seen playing with who was probably Teba's son, Tulin, fighting this insane boss inside the vortex. Let's go over the overworld. Towers were a large part of exploring the overworld. It was encouraged that we collected all of them, as it was our means of unlocking the entire map. It also gives us access to different regions. We see towers meticulously placed on the peak of Mount Lanayru, which gets me excited in terms of how it will be guarded. The journey to get there will surely be epic. The regions included Akkala, Eldin, Faron, Central Hyrule, Necluda, Gerudo, Hebra, and Lanayru. How will these regions change? Let's speak on each region in the order in which we previously mentioned. Akkala is the autumn-themed region with grassy fields, lakes, and woods. It serves as a more dangerous alteration of the neutral, weathered environments. It's home to stronger bokoblins, bokoblins on horseback, moblins, and even Lynels. In Tears of the Kingdom, it will definitely be home to some stronger constructs, Karkaroffs that fly around with bokoblins, moblins, Lynels, and even one of these flame Gleeoks, probably on the Akkala Bridge ruins. Or maybe they'll place a flame Gleeok on one of the be a Kala grassland, so we can use it as an updraft as it spews fire at us. Eldin is the volcanic, mountainous region, which serves as a home for the Gorons and a point of interest throughout Hyrule. In this game, Malice seems to be spewing from the volcano, suggesting that there is something at the bottom of which Breath of the Wild actually took us inside the volcano and to its center with the use of Varudanya, and I'm sure we'll be able to do the same thing by another means in this game. This should also be home to new kinds of fire enemies, such as the Fireland Mola, as we'll call it for now, that we've seen in the art book, as well as new additions. You'll also see that this is home to some sort of massive dungeon, which I personally cannot wait to explore. Faron is a jungle-themed area within Breath of the Wild with multiple provinces. It really loves to rain in Faron and is home to lots of Lizalfos, mighty bananas, and hardy durians. The interesting thing about Faron is that in Breath of the Wild, it was home to the only Zonai structures in the game, besides the labyrinths. Now in Tears of the Kingdom, the Zonai seems to be the face of the game. For this reason, Faron might hold something that the other regions will not, or it might be a major plot device in Breath of the Wild. Possibly some bit of story, a major side quest, or even a special enemy will be present in Faron. And I know for a fact that a Lynel will be here. If there is going to be a lightning version of the Gleeok we've seen, then it will appear in Faron of all places. What if a lightning Gleeok was used to guard one of the pieces of the rubber set, which gives you electricity resistance? That would be genius. Central Hyrule is more or less in the center of Hyrule. It's interesting because in Breath of the Wild, this location was only dangerous due to Hyrule Castle and the corrupted guardians, guarding the way there. Other than that, it was a weather neutral environment with generally open grass areas and some ruins here and there. Because Hyrule Castle is now suspended in the air, it's interesting to ponder what will remain below. Will the grounds composing the area beyond where the central tower was in Breath of the Wild not be as dangerous? Or will there be enemies enhanced by malice as we've seen in Age of Calamity? We also see some areas being inhabited by the Hylians, such as the Sacred Ground Ruins. Necluda is a fairly large region which situates multiple kinds of terrain and provinces. It's most famously home to the Hylians and the Sheikah, such as the Hitino and Kakariko villages. Necluda has the most diversified terrain in the game, hosting forests, lakes, mountains, plains, rivers, villages, and ruins. Because of this, generally the same enemies would probably be put in the region, as well as the new troll-like enemies. This is due to Necluda being sort of out of the way from the beginning of the game, although we don't know where we're going to start in Tears of the Kingdom, although it's heavily suggested that we will start in the sky based on Nintendo's website. I'm more interested in seeing how Kakariko Village and Hateno Village would be updated. Link lives in Hateno Village, meaning there will probably be upgrades to his house, seeing as he's the hero of Hyrule that saved them from the calamity. Specifically in Hateno, we see a strange new obsession with mushrooms, as they've been placed all over the houses and even some people. Again, we see Sheikah soldiers, so perhaps there will be more defense to the towns. This might also be the case seeing as NPCs can fight alongside Link, although I do think this will be similar to when we see bokoblins attacking people, just risen to a slightly larger scale. I also hope to see new characters and new additions to the towns, as well as new services, as I'm sure the geography of the town is actually going to remain the same. In Gerudo, it's questionable on whether or not we'll be allowed to enter the village or the town without dressing up as a female. Ganondorf is the reason why the Gerudo don't allow men in the town, and the fact that he's back and causing chaos in Hyrule makes this prospect unlikely. However, Link did save the Gerudo and Hyrule in Breath of the Wild, and is friends with Riju, the chief of the Gerudo. All these facts, however, didn't lift his restriction in Breath of the Wild, so again, unlikely. Gerudo Town was the most lively and vast out of all the towns, and I do want the same energy of the town to remain in Tears of the Kingdom. The unique side quests and culture that Gerudo gave us was something that was quite memorable. Maybe to recruit Riju for help, we need to initially dress up as a woman to enter Gerudo Town, which would make a good use of the return of the Gerudo outfit. But then once we do have her help, maybe we no longer need to dress up as a female just to enter the town, as we do see some Gerudo soldiers fight alongside Link. I'm also interested in seeing what they'll do to the desert. I stated in a previous video that the desert was quite empty. I'd like to see more content in the desert, whether it be those gangs of Moldugas, specific desert enemies, etc. Since the desert was empty, it creates lots of room for new additions. As the third trailer was launched, we saw some sinkholes in a desert temple or dungeon rise from the sand. Hebra, or Hebra, is the extreme cold, mountainous area with several snowfields. This area is more so reserved for the more dangerous enemies as well as the more exquisite wildlife. This wildlife includes black bears, rhinos, and moose. I would love to see how the animals' AI have changed, if at all, since the last game. Will the new means of hunting mean that the enemies have new means of avoiding or attacking Link? Will the larger enemies actually be dangerous to hunt? We see that the meat is now a more valued resource, being able to put it on arrows to attract enemies and wildlife. Will this work or not work on certain animals or enemies? Will we need better meat to distract more rare wildlife? Obviously, the frost enemies will inhabit Hebra, such as the frost trolls and the frost Gleeok, if there are any. Hebra wasn't used for a main quest in Breath of the Wild unless you count Tabantha as part of Hebra. Maybe they will utilize part of the story here. We do see frost lammolas indicating ice caverns, which should be pretty interesting. Maybe it's not a stretch to think that an ice cavern dungeon would be present. Lanayru holds several mountainous wetlands and rivers. If there is underwater gameplay, this region would make the best use of it by far. We know that we will be revisiting Zora's Domain based on King Dorfin's new outfit. Think back to getting all of the returning armor pieces. Of course, we have to travel to each respective region to do so, but this time, what will the Zora armor grant us? Will it grant us the same abilities as what they do in Breath of the Wild, or will it allow us to swim underwater? You have to think with this mindset because gaining the Zora's chestplate was part of progressing through the story in Breath of the Wild, so will its inclusion hint at something more important taking place in Lanayru? We'll soon find out. There's also another half of Lanayru, which is just a mock version of Hebra. However, there is now a tower on the peak of Mount Lanayru, meaning nature's snowfields might be of more importance than it was in Breath of the Wild this time around. This seems to be the most ambitious tower in terms of its placement from what we've seen so far. So initially I made this video to combat the idea that Tears of the Kingdom was just $70 DLC. Knowing what I know about Breath of the Wild and what I've seen so far from Tears of the Kingdom, I could sort of draw parallels and could assert that the game would be massive, but now with this third trailer, I really didn't have to do much of that. To recap, Tears of the Kingdom will probably have the most ambitious and well-executed story in all the Zelda series, with the inclusion of Ganondorf, the expanded utilization of Malice, the theme of the Zonai, and the expansion of a full voice-acted cast. The story seems promising. The next point are numbers. In the sequel, the number of things that were present in the game it is succeeding tend to increase either slightly or drastically. This means that the number of shrines, the number of main quests, the number of side quests, dungeons, weapons that are present, enemies in the game are all likely to increase. Remember that we'll be getting a lot more and diversified enemies with new and improved ways to fight. They'll probably have different AI and more advanced AI, and will be equipped with new weapons and shields. The wildlife will more likely be updated to make the world feel more alive. Speaking of making the world feel more alive, it seems as though we can recruit Hylians, Gerudo, and other Hyruleans to help us fight enemies. Perhaps this will be in line with a particular quest, or maybe a new system that we are yet to see. That being something in addition to the main shrine and side quests. The Ultra Hand ability will allow us to alter the way in which we approach any possible scenario. This also holds true for the Fuse ability, which will take the 300 plus weapons from Breath of the Wild and combine them for an unreal number of potential combinations and ways to kill enemies. The Ascend ability proves to be useful in terms of getting across environments, providing unique ways in terms of approaching enemies, and even escaping puzzles. The website claimed that the Ascend ability may be used to fight certain enemies, probably the Talus. And finally, imagine all the new little additions that we'll only see once we have the game. This would include things like the cooking system, the user interface, inventory management, so on and so forth. Of course, Nintendo didn't show us everything. I think they just barely scratched the surface in terms of what they did show us, and I'm very excited to see the full extent of this game, which we will see in just a couple of weeks. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. Leave your rating, and I will see you guys in another video. Peace.